Hello, my name is Anthony Lister, and here's my project for AMH 2010, 11 a.m. to 12:15, Tuesdays and Thursdays in fall 2018. So my thesis statement is, without the Federalist Papers, New York would not have ratified the Constitution in fear of a stronger central government. This also goes for northern states and southern states alike, not just New York, but this was the hot spot where the Federalist Papers started. So this first slide, we're going to talk about the reception and the people's reception to the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation when they were made. The Constitution wasn't something that people explicitly asked for or voted on. It was made by the Founding Fathers kind of in secret at first to change the Articles of Confederation since they were not working out. Articles of Confederation was more of like a team of all the states, but they needed the whole thing was way too convoluted to get anything done. All the states needed to agree on one thing for it to be passed. There was no central government to tax or had any real power, especially considering they just got out of a war and they had this huge debt they needed to pay off. The states wouldn't agree on that for sure, but they had no central government to force a tax or any way to repay this debt. So this was definitely something that needed to be changed. The Constitution definitely would be a huge change from the Articles of Confederation, as it did have a larger central government, not a huge one like an authoritarian government, but it was definitely a big step up from how state-centric the Articles of Confederation was. So by the time the word that the Constitution had got out and the ratification process had begun, people were criticizing it and almost fearful that this new, stronger central government would lead them to a monarchy again, or an authoritarian government would. That is when John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton decided all to write the Federalist Papers to kind of support and push for the movement of the ratification of the Constitution. So the Federalist Papers were also met with anti-Federalist papers as well, kind of bashing the new Constitution, saying that it would lead to a monarchy and such things, and the government would almost oppress the people and infringe on their rights that they fought for, but this was not the case at all. So the Federalist Papers definitely received criticism, but soon it received much more praise. It was definitely wrote for the common man too. It was published in almost every New York newspaper. It was published weekly, it seemed, not weekly, but about monthly or so, and these were not short articles though. This was not just a regular newspaper column. These were actual like 4 or 5 page essays on topics of the Constitution, such as the Bill of Rights, some of the people's rights, how judicial review and things like that worked. But we'll get into that later. All three of these men wrote under the name Plubius in the newspaper, as not to show bias or anything. Because if you would read the newspaper and it was written by George Washington, one of the men who created the Constitution, you would clearly think, oh, well, yeah, of course he wants this done. Of course he would want the Constitution to be passed. He made it. But since they wrote under the pseudonym Plubius, there was no real bias to the people that this was something that the government was pushing. And these papers ultimately addressed every fear that the colonists really had about the uncertainty of the Federalist Papers, and kind of soothed it and almost made them actually happy that this was happening as opposed to Articles of Confederation. So let's talk about the papers themselves. As I said earlier, these were essays made to convince New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution. These were later printed on a mass scale and sent down south as well and a little farther north to more colonies and states as they gained popularity. It was a collection of 80 plus essays, 5 written from John Jay after he fell sick. James Madison wrote 26 of them, some of which were the most influential, but Hamilton wrote the other 51 essays, all by himself. James Madison and Hamilton kind of edited and co-authored each other's essays. They would kind of review them before sending them out as to make sure they're on the up and up, but they never really did any huge edits. And as I said earlier, they wrote under the pseudonym Pluvius. They published in New York newspapers, and the demands became so high for reprints that they just decided to make the Federalist Papers into books at the very end in 1788, and these books sold even more than the newspapers did. One such argument was conflicting parties and interests would preserve the Republic. So as we talked about in class, George Washington, he didn't get a bunch of yes men that agreed with him on many things to side with his cabinet, but instead he got people who knew would butt heads with each other. So even though he did warn against factions, these weren't quite factions, as they weren't as radical as anything else. They definitely weren't as radical as a regular faction would be, but they did bump heads. But this was good because there were conflicting interests for people to side with. So if you didn't like one side, you could still side with the other and push for a change. And all these essays, of course, at first 6, maybe 7, were sent to George Washington to review them. And he did see their success in New York as they first started, and he demanded they be sent to places such as Virginia and North Carolina. Some notable essays from the Federalist Papers were Federalist number 10 for sure. This detailed the separation of powers, yet shared between states and federal. This is kind of highlighting the system we have today where states can still have laws, but there is also federal law governing it. But sometimes states have a little leeway between those laws. And it was also on the topic of those political factions and parties, as they should be feared, but it is a good thing to preserve the Republic. Federalist number 51, I believe this one was also written by James Madison as well. He detailed the systems of checks and balances to maintain power, how the executive branch can check, the Congress, and the judicial can check Congress, etc. And Federalist number 78 details the power of judicial review to interpret the Constitution in such court cases or in cases of the legislative branch trying to pass something that really should not be passed. So some closing notes and what can be learned from the Federalist Papers. While the United States does not have a perfect government, it is for the people in the end. It doesn't seem like it at times, but it is made by the people for the people. I believe it has changed since 1788 with scummy practices within government, but I believe they still try their best. The Founding Fathers were not gods, though, as many people believe. George Washington was not a god when he made the Constitution, and with all those other men such as James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson, but they really did try their best to make a perfect union. And they were doing this from scratch, something that had never been done before. It's a pretty impressive feat, since all other governments since then have been monarchy or some kind of feudal or tribal government. So it was pretty great. And the Federalist Papers, to me, was the best kind of check that they could have had. They wrote under pseudonyms and even addressed flaws in the new Constitution, but they addressed the many good things it had to protect civil rights. It also allowed the fathers to talk about the work they just did, as opposed to saying, we have a new form of government, this is how it works, goodbye. They went into very full detail on many of these subjects, 81 essays or so of this, detailing each part of the government, how it helps the people, how it helps them. Many governments today, I know, would not do that. When you go to vote on a ballot, For a new law, you get a short paragraph and that's it. So I think this was a very good thing to happen. Even the Anti-Federalist Papers addressing flaws, which could be countered by the Federalist Papers, it was just something that needed to happen, and I fully believe that they definitely checked themselves with the Federalist Papers. If the system was truly as flawed as people thought it was, they would have realized it when writing the essays, but they knew what they were talking about. They knew how they could be circumvented, how they can be fixed, and anything else. Thank you.